Recently, Forrest said searchers are stomping on the ants while the elephants run by, which is another way of saying you can't see the forest for the trees. Oh, I've got a typo there. That's better. This video today is about the forest, the elephant, the big picture. I want to fly over the memoir, provide outline ideas, talk about the theme, talk about structure, author's choices, and just about how strange this book is. This is an unusual book in its details, but also when you step back and look at the bigger picture. So let's begin. After a preface and an introduction, the thrill of the chase moves chronologically from Forrest Fenn's first grade year in 1936 through his 79th year in 2010. The book culminates with his cancer diagnosis and a decision to hide the treasure. A sister chapter also describes Forrest's meditations on mortality, time, and hiding artifacts. After that, it's final thoughts, an ode to his wife, and an epilogue for his father. Chapters are bite-sized. Most chapters are 3 to 6 pages. There are exceptions, but for the most part, these are little vignettes, glimpses. The chapters aren't numbered. I take important literature as the introduction. It's presented that way. So I'm seeing 24 chapters. Although chapter 24 and the epilogue, in my opinion, are of a piece, final words. That is, the climax, the big reveal, is in Goldenmore, and with the sister chapter, chapter 23, that reinforces the same ideas. Forrest has described hiding this treasure chest as probably the most profound thing I ever did in my life. So while it is highly unusual for memoir, of course, it figures into this story hand in glove. It flows out of deeply held beliefs and lessons learned. A general outline is not too troublesome, though if you asked 100 searchers to outline the book, you'd end up with 100 variations. Here's one centered around the idea of memories, but there are a couple of chapters that give me difficulty. Here's another outline based on geography, but it's not that tidy. Everything after chapter 20 is set in the present, which means Santa Fe, geographically, but from here the book isn't about memories and the chapters aren't wedded to their geography in the way that the rest of the book is. Here's another stab at an outline based on geography, but taking the memoir more as a coming-of-age story. It's difficult to prevent your outline from quickly becoming interpretive, which is fine, but it's also a helpful exercise to try and step back to create one that isn't driven by other factors. So as far as basic structure, it's somewhat traditional for memoir, but look closer and you see some unusual choices. First, well over a third of the book concerns his life only up to about age 19. This large section is notable for its omissions. It says very little about certain significant people in his life, certain family members, his future wife Peggy. As in a lot of memoirs, the story bounces around in time. Chapter 6, for example, briefly talks about his extended family prior to his own birth, providing context for his place in the immediate family as a middle child. Second, on the heels of this section, a single chapter covers roughly the same amount of time, a 20-year stint in the Air Force. Once again, this chapter is highly selective and also out of order. Despite covering 1950 to 1970, it mainly centers around a few events in late 1968, then details a seemingly innocuous event that occurred more than a decade earlier. Third, at the close of this chapter, the reader is more than 2/3 of the way through the book, but Forrest is only 40. Fourth, and this is really surprising, only 4 chapters center around his life in Santa Fe, covering roughly a 35-year period. Very little is said about his work as the owner of the largest art gallery in Santa Fe, and there's really nothing about his work as an archaeologist or an author. Forrest could fill a whole memoir with just memories from the 90s, or what he did during the 2000s. But in the thrill of the chase, hardly anything happens after mid-1980. My War for Me, the central pivotal chapter in the memoir, is both the longest by far and the most personal in that it describes a couple of life-changing incidents. The book's theme is here. The emotional center of the book is here. The way the material is presented makes it feel somewhat out of place, and it's not surprising to learn that it was written several years earlier for a different purpose and published online. In fact, a number of the chapters were published previously. He said he wrote the memoir in about 6 weeks, which seems impossible until you realize that big chunks already existed. Forrest's relationship with his father is a through line that creates momentum and is a space where he explores his theme of life's meaning in the face of death. Marvin Fenn is ever present in the early chapters that pertain to school, and in a very moving epilogue, Forrest demands that readers take notice of his father's life and remember the impact he had. However, this is a weak through line. This is not a book about a son's relationship with his father. Marvin Fenn is in the background in the Yellowstone chapters and in those about his brother's hijinks. Surviving Myself, with its self-referential title, marks a turning point where Forrest separates himself from his father, the disciplinarian, who likes his brother more, from his mother, who didn't seem to involve herself in his being disciplined, from his sister, who is the family pet, and from Skippy, who was turning alpha and was above certain things that Forrest cared about. The chapter ends with a final act of separation from the family patriarch, what Forrest describes as getting even with his father. This chapter begins with traditions of Sunday dinner and family harmony, and ends with the picture of a young man, maybe only 10 or 11, feeling ready to separate himself and be independent. Here he touches on the theme again, of course. In the following chapter, Forrest jumps out the same window, runs to the same cemetery, but continues on, even farther away from home. There's just a hint of sexual awakening here, but the main point is about separation, independence, the desire to leave the nest. One would expect these ideas to come to fruition in the chapters that follow, but they don't fully materialize. Yes, there are outlandish pranks, the sorts of things teenagers do, but 2 of the stories are about his brother's adventures. After a brief introduction to Yellowstone in Chapter 9, Forrest gets a job. It's easy to fill in the gaps if you've heard Forrest describe these vacations, but there's not a single story here about fly fishing. If it weren't for the pictures, we wouldn't even know he did it. The payoff finally comes in Chapter 13. As I was saying before, this book is not about Forrest's relationships, even his relationship with his father. In most of the book, our protagonist acts alone. He does not have parental supervision as he and a friend head out to look for Lewis and Clark. He chooses to masquerade as a college student and sleeps alone in a pasture when he's caught. He enlists in the Air Force. He and Peggy build a business. Even as he returns briefly to the passion of his childhood in fly water, his father is mentioned only in passing. Forrest may have learned how to fish from his dad, but he has relished it for most of his life because it was a time of solitude and reflection. Speaking of fly water, this chapter stands out for its excellent prose. An extended metaphor opens like a flower. The writing here is exalted, with its meditations on the sweetness of life and the inevitability of death. Despite all of the unusual choices I've alluded to, perhaps the most unusual chapter in the entire book is the introduction. I want to talk about that in a separate video. To make sure you don't miss it, subscribe below. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.